What is up, theology nerds? This is Tripp, and today you're going to get a little preview of a project Tom Oord and I have been working on. It's called God After Deconstruction. We surveyed thousands of people and tried to find out what was the big question that generated their faith transition, their deconstruction. Was it the problem of evil, pluralism? Was it the rise of Christian nationalism? I mean, there's so many different reasons that have generated the kind of pressure that forces faith transition that we wanted to explore it. And then we've been working on this project, God After Deconstruction, to really introduce an attempt to wrestle with the word, concept, reality of God that doesn't say repress, deny, ignore legitimate challenges to faith. So if you're interested in that, check out this. This is the first of 10 videos Tom and I have produced tackling the different issues. This is kind of an introduction, but if you dig it, go to godafterdeconstruction.com. You can donate anything between $0 and $1 million. You'll immediately get access to all 10 videos. You can use them in a group and watch them by yourself. And then you'll be invited to a series of live streams throughout the month of April, where you can ask questions, dig in and get deeper, nerdier, and all that kind of good stuff. But, thank you for checking this out. For the thousands of you that responded to filled out the survey, I deeply appreciate it. And I hope you enjoy this. godafterdeconstruction.com. And if you're digging it, later this month in April, Tom and I are doing a live event in Denver, which you can find out at the website, godafterdeconstruction.com. And we'll be digging into it even more at Theology Beer Camp this October. So there you go.
Hello, everyone. This is Tripp, and I'm here with Tom, and we're excited that you decided to be a part of a God After Deconstruction group, whether you're doing it with friends or a small group or in a church group or hanging out with us on the internet. We're glad you're here, and this is part of a much larger project. It's not even just this class. We've been doing some events in person and also working on a book. The same title together. And so we're really invested in kind of facilitating and provoking conversations for those that don't know how to think out loud or speak God again after deconstruction. And each of those kind of journeys for anyone is inseparable from their own story. And so while Tom and I have been friends a long time, we both have had our own faith transitions at different points around different topics and such. So our goal in this first session is to kind of give you an idea of what we're hoping to accomplish, but also let y'all get to know a little bit about us. And hopefully it provokes in conversations, both in person and online, you being able to find language or the stories that really capture and enable you to share your own faith transitions.
Yeah, I was on social media this morning and hearing, looking at various reels and posts of people who self-identify as in the process of deconstructing or having already been deconstructed. And the stories are diverse. I mean, the reasons that people deconstruct are varied, and the kind of place where people find themselves in deconstruction or after deconstruction, those vary widely. I recently heard someone make criticize saying, well, deconstruction is just for white evangelicals. And the literature that I've been reading and the conversations that we've been having suggest that no, it's not just white people. It's not just straight people. It's not just evangelicals. It's not just North Americans. This is a wide-ranging phenomenon. It's also not just young people; it's older people, and I think at least I'm hoping that we can capture something of the diversity and embrace and honor all of the stories, while also pointing to some of the commonalities. Because we have identified those commonalities in not only the books we're reading, but the polls and the research we've been doing, and in our own just day-to-day interaction with this myriad of people that you and I get to hang out with. Mm-hmm. I think it's right to say. I think Brad Jurczak, our common friend, is right to say that in many ways we're living in what he calls the great deconstruction. Um, and I think it's worth exploring. So I'm happy everyone has joined us.
Yeah. No, before we kind of dig in to the more macro framing ideas, we hope, generate conversation and such. I think it's worth each of us sharing a bit about, where deconstruction in a sense was thrown or thrust upon us.
Yeah.
So Tom, what's the moment in time where you realize that kind of inherited faith that you had as a Nazarene and such came and encountered the kind of questions and doubts that the simplicity that you were born into just didn't have the power to stay and have your eyes open and your experiences acknowledged?
Yeah, when I think about my deconstruction story, I actually have two stories, and they roughly correlate with the kind of two primary meanings of deconstruction. The first deconstruction was when I was in college. I was a religion major, evangelist, on fire for Jesus, the kind of guy who would talk to you on an airplane about, wanting you to ask Jesus into your heart, or come up to you at a bar and strike up a conversation about Jesus. I was a part of Campus Crusade for Christ, so had the four spiritual laws and all that sort of thing. And then in near the end of my college career, I took a course in philosophy of religion, and for the first time really took seriously people who thought differently about God, and folks from other religious traditions, atheists, agnostics, and taking the intellectual issue seriously pulled the rug out from underneath me. Or at least, maybe a better way to say it is, I had to be honest with my beliefs and realized I couldn't be certain like I thought I could be. And that was a huge moment in my life. And it, in some ways, I'm still in the process of recovering from that moment or living into that moment. But that was my first deconstruction. The second one is more related to what in philosophy is the deconstructionist understanding from Jacques Derrida. And that was realizing that I couldn't rely upon language to give me the absolute truth of things. And I had to look in other ways to find any kind of confidence in the way I thought life ought to be, if there was a God, that sort of thing. But language could no longer function as my foundation. How about you?
Yeah, I can think of a number of moments, but the biggest one was when we moved. My family were Baptist church planters, and we moved from rural North Carolina into the capital city of Raleigh. And all of a sudden, the religious diversity around me changed from the kind of Baptist you were, right? We definitely wouldn't have been sure about Nazarenes or Methodists.
We wouldn't have been sure about you either. So.
and I remember, like, when all of a sudden your classroom has multiple religious traditions in it, and people who grew up in homes that weren't, in a particular tradition. The very same language I used 50 miles away sounded and was received different. Yeah. And yes, that connects to like the insufficiency of language, if you're saying it nerdy, right, that postmodern deconstructionists type point at. But it also shows just how where you find yourself in the world when consciousness comes on, and like your race, gender, class, nation, all these kinds of things. At what point in the human timeline, who your parents are and what they do with their time, all those things have this huge framing on you. And yet, as I realized, my friends who were in other religious traditions had also encountered the divine in different ways and used different language, symbols, and rituals and such. I did not have an easy answer for the questions that were there, but I knew the kind of like the inherited ones, or the quick ones on the front of your tongue just didn't work. And that, to me, was disturbing, but not like destructive. It really wasn't until I got to college, right, and the more intellectual stuff's going on, that things really came where I got insecure in some sense about my faith, where the doubt hit bedrock of sorts. And it wasn't an intellectual idea, though I was wrestling with the problem of evil. It was the church's response after 9/11. And it's kind of seeming that we all of a sudden, Christians, became the ones most confident about what we need to do to our enemies violently. And who was it that was most likely to be saying Islamophobic things, or bearing false witness against our Muslim neighbors and such? It was Christians. And when there were just these kind of like public performances in the public square of just things that seemed so far from the teachings of Jesus, I didn't know what to do with it. And that's when I had the fear, or the fear and trembling of sorts, of this inherited identity that I had been making my own. Now I didn't know if this is the tribe I belong to anymore, if this is coming out. Like when other friends of mine that were Christians mocked and belittled me for praying for my enemies, I didn't know what to do. And I couldn't make sense of it. But I knew whatever we thought we had in common, it may not be as much as I thought.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up that you mentioned that word fear, because I know in this series that we're doing, we're going to talk primarily about ideas, beliefs, that sort of thing. And those are really important. But I think there is, at least for me as well, a major portion of deconstruction was an emotional ride that I was, and still am in certain degrees, on. And I was also fearful. Um, I thought about my parents, people in the church who had invested in me. And here I was now thinking things differently than they did. And not just like, I now like I don't know, the Seahawks instead of the Cowboys. It was, these are fundamental things they thought mattered most in life. And so I had this psychological distress for a long time, but simultaneously, a kind of freedom, a kind of like a release from these, I guess they were intellectual pressure points. So it was a mixed set of emotions: fear and freedom, distress and a kind of joy, or I don't know, enlightenment sounds too heady, but something that, I don't know, my emotions were all over the place, and even today sometimes can be all over the place.
Mm-hmm. To me, this may be odd, or it might be revelatory of just how nerdy I was in undergrad philosophy, but it was actually one of those postmodern philosophers that gave me language for thinking about what I was doing. It wasn't Derrida, but it was Gadamer.
Okay.
And there's a number of different philosophers that do deconstruction in without the cultural moment scare quotes in it. And it was how he talked about tradition, because that fear that you had, and I think I had, like, one of the things in it was this fear of, well, am I allowed to say this, acknowledge this, experience this, question this, doubt this? Am I allowed to do I still get to belong and have this identity that's really important to me, right? And my encounter with the divine, my personal piety and spiritual life, the time I would have said over under, is there an actual ultimate reality? I'm not confident. My actual spiritual experiences were always deep. And so I'm like, what is it that, how do I make sense of these things? Right. And Gadamer spends time talking about tradition, but in a different way, as opposed to like tradition having these set boundaries where you should be fearful if you go beyond them or outside of them. Because he said part of it is, there were kind of like three ideas about tradition that he had. One was like, tradition is something we can cultivate gratitude for, But to cultivate gratitude for a tradition is to understand it doesn't have the power you might think it does. Right. And so how do you do it? Is it a tradition? He said it's not all good and it's not all settled. Like any tradition. And now obviously I'm thinking of my Christian tradition. It's not hard if you're a Baptist to know that everything's not settled, because all it takes is one disagreement at a church council meeting, and there's now two churches that are formed because you have a disagreement about how to read the Bible. And then you discover, right, there are other Protestants, maybe Nazarenes, Methodists, Episcopalians, and they all have different traditions. And we don't even all agree. And so, like, the idea, like, once you acknowledge just the diversity within Protestantism, let alone the rest of the church or the other religious traditions, like, the idea it's settled when your tribe didn't even exist for most of church history, right? Like, then what do you do about that? And then it's not all good. We were Southern Baptists. We created our denomination apart from the others so that we could have missionaries that own slaves work in Africa. Now, there are other elements to the story, but also it's not all good. And we, as denominations, we've repented, we've named it, we're trying to learn and grow from it, some better than others. But like if it's not all good and it's not all settled, and yet you can have gratitude for it, it's a different way of seeing tradition. And the reason is Gadamer's thing, the third part about tradition for him that really gave me permission. He said, tradition enables asking of questions, but you can't ask every question at the same time. So you're stuck with this inherited narratives, rituals, symbols, and that's how you learn to think and engage the ultimate. And it's sitting there. It's not all good. It's not all settled. And yet, in order to raise this question, say around Christian nationalism, or this one around the ecological crisis, or this one around the problem of evil and suffering and divine power, to do it, you're going to ask them, what are you working with? How are you thinking it out? Well, here's how you become grateful for the tradition. Is there's just a collection of voices, wisdom, and text and practices that have grounded this experience, that have animated your discipleship and engagement in the world, that even provoked these questions. What do you do with them? And like, it was Gadamer's reframing of this that made the philosophical version of deconstruction he articulated kind of an invitation to go, all right, I don't know where I'm going to end up, but I do know nothing gets me quite as jazzed as the image of the ultimate forgiving those that are crucifying him and insisting that ultimate reality deserves the name Abba. Abba, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And I was very sure we don't know what we're doing. Looking at what Christians basically, being the frontier of nationalistic, Islamophobic rhetoric and war and such. But that notion of tradition helped me think of, like, how am I grateful for what's not all good and not all settled? Because it helps me ask questions. And it's the story, what Jesus said, did, endured, what he embodied, that has kind of given me a framework that wasn't settled or all good to wrestle against it, to rework it and inherit it, hopefully in a more beautiful way in my life. And if we're lucky, we hope our kids and grandkids inherit it and realize what we have isn't all good and all settled, and that it can be more, it can be more beautiful.
Yeah, that's some really great insights there. As you were talking about tradition, especially, I was thinking about my own relationship with tradition, which is, mixed. Obviously, there's no tradition that's perfect, but I suspect that, Tripp, you and I, as much as the tradition has sometimes been bad to us, we know lots of friends for whom their tradition, particularly a local congregation, has just been downright evil to them, hurtful and harmful to the place. They can't imagine reappropriating tradition or looking at the tradition and kind of saying, well, there's some good and some bad. I'm going to try to keep the good. They're like I'll just use the word harmed again. They're so deeply harmed by what's happened to them emotionally, sometimes sexually, physically, that they can't imagine reappropriating something. And we'll get to that in some of the later lectures. But I just want to put that on the table for some folks who are listening to this opening lecture and hearing you talk about tradition. And some of them are like me and they're saying, yeah, great point. And others are like, what? There's something in the tradition that's salvageable? Not after what they did to me.
Yeah.
And
Well, in tradition there, right, is that framework. He's not using it for like, the philosopher Gadamer is not introducing it to help you think through faith, your faith tradition. I mean, but
Okay.
we do the same thing, right, with political tradition, like democracy. Like, in what ways is it not all good and not all settled? How are you grateful for it? But it also gives a context for thinking about it. And part of the challenge of democracy is figuring out how we ask different questions at different times to become more beautiful and establish more justice in these things. But recognizing that, Sartre's line about we're always already embarked. And that bit is something that more I internalized, or Heidegger's notion of thrownness or whatever, where you didn't pick where you showed up, but like you're always already embarked. And so oftentimes the narrow, fear-oriented, more authoritarian expressions of a tradition will say something, well, you're always already embarked on the holy inerrant one arc of salvation, these kinds of things.
Yeah.
But if you realize just how every thing that involves human language, everything that's an institution or community that involves us is at least as human as we are, and then that notion that we're always already embarked as a person and as people and communities in tradition it kind of gave me permission to be more honest about the questions I have about the tradition that I inherited, to the permission to challenge the ugliness and violence that you see places. And it's not personal, because there's no human being who's ever not always already been embarked. Like you and you didn't pick it, you didn't choose it, and you're there. And then it's like, what are you going to do with it? Right? In deconstruction as a cultural moment, not the philosophical one, I think is a growing number of people, for a host of different reasons, go, well, I may find myself here, but I can't stick around if this is what I'm swallowing, or this is what I have to do, or this is what I have to tolerate. And so, like, knowing that, what do we imagine, like the hypothetical utopian somewhere else, or the perfect X, Y, and Z, and rotate around the different traditions or collectives or communities and try to find the perfect one? And there are people who've been harmed in ways they aren't going to feel safe and be able to flourish in one particular religious community or whatever. But knowing that all human collectives are, in some sense, constructed out of the people that came before you, and you're a part wherever you find yourself, and what gets handed on, made me go, well, then what if I do this intentionally, knowing that I'm a part of something and I will be handing something on, and that to be human, the way we even learn to cooperate and communicate as a species, is tied to like these kinds of things. What do you do with it? And it gave me a permission to have a more generous interpretation for those that handed me things I find vile and repulsive. What if they were always already embarked in a place, and this is what they had, and then this came to me? And now we're at a point, I think, where there's a growing number of people who, someone that would sign up for this class, like it says God and deconstruction, right? Then it's, what do you do when there's a growing number of people that say we can't do it the same, and yet I don't know if I want to give up on whatever's harbored in those, in the word God, and in the story of Jesus, and in the practices that are a part of the church.
Yeah, that's good. And the way you put that, I think, helps me to kind of transition into thinking about that word God and deconstruction and wanting to be clear to the folks who are listening to this that what we're trying to work through and maybe help with and lead and at least give witness to in our own lives is different than the way some people think about deconstruction. There are some people today who are mocking deconstruction, or they're saying you're deconstructing, all you really need to do is just believe the Bible better. If you just had the right view of scripture, then you'd know it was inerrant, and et cetera, et cetera. And there are some books that are generated now and some conversations, people taking that view. Another view of deconstruction was articulated by a Facebook friend of mine recently. He said, people are deconstructing either want to watch football instead of go to church on Sunday morning, or they just want to sleep around. So he basically was saying deconstructors people who just want to set aside what they thought previously were these, moral virtues and things. And we think deconstruction is far more significant than that. And then there's some people who there's a partial truth to this one, and that is they'll say deconstruction is nothing new. Christians have been deconstructing for 2,000 years because deconstruction is just a reevaluation of your faith. And there's something right about that, but many people in the present are saying that what's happening in our space today has some differences from what's happened in the past and some similarities. Some of the differences are a greater distrust of institutions, greater access to information because of social media, more polarization in culture wars and society. So there's some differences, but there's also some similarities. And among the similarities, you and I have been thinking about these issues for a while. We know that there are templates or paradigms for thinking about the movement people go through in their faith journey. Paul Ricoeur's first and second naivete is often mentioned in the academy. James Fowler's stages of faith is big in psychology. And in the book that you and I are writing, we draw upon Brian McLaren's recent work where he identifies 4 stages. And I'll just sort of throw them out here real quick, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it, Tripp. The first stage is simplicity, in which people basically see the world as black and white, good and evil, right and wrong. These people typically desperately want an absolute authority they can trust. They're typically certain God exists and God is on their side. They're not usually able to think in ambiguous or complex ways. And in some ways, the simplicity stage is developmentally appropriate for someone under the age of 10. We don't expect the 5-year-old to be able to deal with ambiguities in the way we would a 25-year-old. Second stage of faith, according to Brian, he calls it complexity. And these folks typically operate from the same basic view of God they had in the simplicity stage, but they realize that life has nuance. They need to be more sophisticated in how they think about this. Oftentimes, folks in the complexity stage are kind of building on the simplistic ideas of God, but then thinking about growth, thinking about how to have a bigger church, how to solve particular problems in the community and the world based on this worldview that they're assured of. The third stage, Brian calls perplexity. And this is when what most people call deconstruction in the more popular understanding. And that's these beliefs that we had, these assumptions we had about who God is and about how life works. Those assumptions just no longer work. Things fall apart. And this might begin because people have a nagging question. It might begin because people have some sort of evil event or horrific event that happens in their life, maybe an accident, or maybe they're abused. Sometimes people start down this path because the person or thing that they thought was absolutely authoritative, be that the Bible or the pastor, all of a sudden you find out something's wrong. The pastor has a moral failure, or they find errors in scripture, or whatever. And then the fourth stage that Brian offers is called harmony. And Brian thinks of harmony as able to integrate those positive aspects of the previous stages, but rejecting what is unhelpful. So, in some sense, to transcend what doesn't make sense and bring together in a kind of humble way, an open way, a way of humility and change, but not be like total chaos, sort of having some integrative stance to all of that. And I think for our project here, we're mostly aiming our ideas at those last two categories, the perplexity stage of people and the harmony stage. What do
Mhm.
you think of that?
No, I agree that of like where this is aimed, right? And I don't even want to belittle people that have not had the faith they were born into disrupted to the point that they need to go somewhere. Like there are beautiful lives that care dearly for their neighbors and pray for their enemies at
Mm,
each stage. And I think is like oftentimes stages make people think, oh, is one better or worse than others, and that kind
gotcha.
of thing. And I would say, like in every stage, there are different levels of healthy expression of it.
Mm,
And what we're hoping to do in kind of facilitating, you know, provoking nerdy conversations around these different topics is to allow for a healthy engagement and conversation so that the burdens or the pain or the doubts or the struggles or the questions don't fester and generate lives where you live out the pain and frustration towards others.
mm.
And yeah, there are times it definitely did for me. I don't know. Luckily, we're running short on time, so I won't do my confession now. Um, but even that notion of harmony isn't like a final stage type of thing that you arrive and then you're walking around, glowing. I mean, harmony is an invitation where you realize that contradictions are not like dead ends, and
Mm,
and also like to attend to harmony. What is harmonious in one moment is different than what's harmonious in the next moment. And if you get to the place where questions and doubts and challenges and injustice continue to provoke and animate and move you in different ways, but your responsiveness is how those like facilitate a more beautiful or harmonious expression in your own life or in your community. Then I mean, I think that's a way. That stage isn't something you get to that is, oh, I've crescendoed. It's really an orientation for a different mode of engagement. And so, yeah, I mean, we'll be exploring that. Uh,
yeah.
one of the, I think right before we end, because our real hope for those of you engaging this in different groups is that you get to share a bit of your own story. That like what was the question or challenge or issue that generated the kind of energy where you'd sign up to be here. And so Tom, when you think about the book we're working on, all the surveys and everything that led up to figuring out what are the big issues for that generated faith transition for the present, maybe like name a few of them so people get an idea, and then send them out to discuss. Because next week we're going to figure out how to be completely certain about everything.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, the nine major issues that we're going to look at, I can just name them, rattle them off quickly. So these are the reasons that people say they've deconstructed, and these reasons arise from the surveys, the books, all the kind of data we've collected. So first one, people decide they can't be certain about things they thought they were 100% certain about. So the loss of certainty. Secondly, the Bible for many people was that certain foundation, and all of a sudden they find errors or the God described there isn't consistent. So that's a reason they deconstruct. Third, the problem of evil, which you and I have already mentioned and spent a lot of time with. That is, if there really is a good and loving, powerful God, then why is there genuine evil in the world? Uh, Church abuse, many, many people who deconstruct do so because they've just been harmed in various ways by people who call themselves Christian, by institutions and organizations that claim to be Christ-like. Christian nationalism, the fusing, especially in America, of Trumpian politics led many people to say, I've had enough of church and religion. I can't buy this. So Christian nationalism, conflicts with science, whether it's the age-old questions about evolution or more recent questions about God's relation to climate change and the pandemic and what ought to be the appropriate Christian responses to that, the trust of science. Many people just said, look, if these Christians are going to continue to think that the world is 10,000 years old when the evidence is overwhelmingly not that, then I can't be a part of this. Religious diversity. More and more people know that there are good ways of thinking outside of the tradition they've been raised in. And then finally, the question of purpose. The list started out with questions of certainty. Many people now are wondering, okay, well, what is the purpose of life in general and my life in particular? So those are the big reasons and topics we're going to explore.
Yeah. Well, thank you for all of y'all that are here. Looking forward to engaging you online or hearing what happens in the in-person discussion groups. We will see you all next time for session 2 on certainty or after certainty, or who knows exactly what it will be titled because we're just not certain.